Hosted in conjunction with CRIISP Media, the CEO interview series allows investors to hear directly from the CEOs leading the companies featured on Wholesale Investor. Enjoy the interview and reach out via the details in the description.
Hi and welcome to another CRIISP Q&A. Today I'm joined by Peter McGregor, CEO of CRIISP Infrastructure. Thank you for joining me, Peter.
Hi, Sidney. Great to be here.
Peter, it's great to have you for this interview. And just to inform our audience members and set us on the correct course today, can you give us a high-level overview of CRIISP Infrastructure?
Sure. So CRIISP Infrastructure Management is a specialist fund manager in the infrastructure space. Our key investment product is the CRIISP Infrastructure Fund, which we launched in late 2020. And the fund is designed to provide wholesale investors, particularly high net worth individuals and self-managed super funds, with competitive long-term low volatility returns by way of access to a portfolio of high quality infrastructure assets. The bulk of the assets are in the unlisted infrastructure assets located in Australia, managed by Infrastructure Capital Group. But we also have an exposure to a global portfolio of high quality listed infrastructure businesses managed by Atlas Infrastructure.
Excellent. Now I'm going to ask you a question about the origin story with CRIISP Infrastructure Fund. Can you tell us from inception what was the motivation behind starting this fund? Did you identify key problems in the market that sort of spurred this endeavour?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because we really did establish this fund as a way to address what we perceived as being a couple of problems, particularly a couple of gaps. I guess one of the observations we'd make is that over recent years we've seen a very significant shift in large-scale infrastructure assets away from the listed space and into the hands of major unlisted managers. So the most obvious recent examples are Sidney Airport and AusNet, which have both recently been delisted and now sit within significant institutional portfolios. The challenge that brings is that for individual investors, there's been a shrinking pool of assets available and a shrinking number of opportunities to gain access to high quality infrastructure assets. Generally, the major funds that are holding these assets now are only available to investment by institutional investors. So we see the establishment of the fund as effectively filling that gap in the market and providing sophisticated individual investors, wholesale investors, the ability to access assets that are increasingly only generally available to institutional investors. The other gap we've seen in the market is, for sophisticated investors, just an ability to fill the gap in their portfolio between high return but volatile equity exposure at one end of the spectrum and low volatility, low return bond exposure at the other end of the portfolio. And we see this fund as being ideally placed to effectively fill that gap in portfolios. And the underlying objective is to provide our investors effectively with equity-like returns, but a bond-like risk profile.
That makes perfect sense. So it's obviously we're talking here about bridging a gap and providing a new offering to a market that may not have been able to tap this as an investment opportunity before. Can you talk to us about the discerning principles you have at CRIISP Infrastructure? What is the unique investment methodology, just to give us a bit of confidence in how you approach these decisions?
Yeah, and look, in a sense, we are a little bit agnostic around what sort of assets we invest in terms of specific industries and specific subsectors. What really drives our investment philosophy is the key underlying characteristics. We are a very, very committed investor, only in assets that have those true, genuine infrastructure-like characteristics. We're very, very focused on the core and super core end of the infrastructure space. And I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about what that actually means. I guess one of the observations we'd make through COVID is that one thing that COVID's taught us over the last couple of years is that infrastructure is not really a single homogenous asset class. There's a whole range of risk-return profiles across the infrastructure space. And for example, we've seen in some of the major listed infrastructure entities in the past couple of years, very, very significant volatility, particularly in the airport space and in the toll road space. And that reflects the fact that those assets are very, very heavily correlated to economic activity and GDP. Our focus is much more at the other end of the spectrum. Those assets that have very low volatility, very secure long-term revenue streams, underpinned by either regulation or high-quality long-term contracts. So our offering is very, very much around low volatility, low GDP exposure, and high correlation, amongst other things, to CPI. The other thing we think that makes us unique in the space is our exposure to renewable assets. As we've sort of seen the broader economy transition away from traditional carbon-based fuel sources and look to increase exposure to more environmentally fuel sources, we're seeing investors want to shift their portfolios in exactly the same direction as well. And what makes us unique is that within our portfolio, 55% of our total funds are invested in renewable energy assets. So that's across a range of wind farms, solar installations, and hydro plants. And again, we see that as being genuinely unique. There is not another wholesale fund in Australia that has over half of its assets invested into the renewable space. And we think that's really tapping into demand from the investor base.
Absolutely. Sounds like some very unique value being offered to that investor base. Now, perhaps you could give us a bit of insight into some numbers behind True Infrastructure, and more specifically your track record, anything you think is worth highlighting for prospective investors watching this video.
Sure. So we're very, very pleased with the performance of the fund since inception. So for the most recent 12 months, the 12 months until the end of February, the total portfolio return, so this is after fees, but before investment tax, was 11.4%. And the return since inception back in 2020 has been 10.5%. So that's well above our target return, which is 8%, inclusive of a 4% plus gross yield, and also well above our benchmark, which is CPI plus 4%. So as I say, we're very, very pleased with the way the fund's performed since inception. I think it's fair to say there's a combination of factors, but it really reflects very, very good performance by our underlying fund managers, ICG and Atlas Infrastructure, to drive returns from the underlying funds. We've also been able to make some strategic acquisitions and new investments in the last 12 months on reasonably favourable terms. And we've also actively managed the portfolio, and particularly the exposure between the listed and unlisted components, to sort of minimise exposure to market volatility. So taken all together, that's what's generated the excess return. And as I say, we're very, very pleased to have generated the performance we had over our first year and a half or so.
Well, congratulations on that today, Peter. And I want to ask you a bit more. You've touched on this point a little bit about the team behind True Infrastructure. Give us a bit of insight into the skills they bring to the table, the experience, and why we're in safe hands when we commit to a fund like yours.
Yeah, thanks, Sidney. Great question, because again, I think one of the things I've learned over many, many years in the space is that, this really is a people business. Experience genuinely counts in the funds management game, and we're absolutely delighted to have the team we have. So our founder and chairman is Mike Fitzpatrick. Mike, as you may be aware, is one of the pioneers of the infrastructure investment space in Australia. Literally been involved in the sector from its very earliest days and origins back in the mid-1990s. And Mike was the founder of Hastings Funds Management, which grew to be grew to be basically the largest independent fund manager in the space prior to sale to Westpac a number of years ago. So Mike's our chairman, actively involved in setting the strategic direction and the key investment decisions for the fund. We're also delighted to have on our board Miriam Patterson, and Miriam brings to the table very, very significant experience in the real assets space. She was previously head of real assets at Telstra Super, so that basically covered their property and infrastructure portfolios, managing a $4 billion portfolio on behalf of Telstra Super. And Miriam also, as a day job, is a very senior executive at Charter Hall, so brings a very, very strong funds management perspective and knowledge base to the table. My own background, similar to Mike, I've been involved in the sector since the mid-90s in a variety of capacities. I spent many years as the head of infrastructure and utilities at Goldman Sachs for Australia and New Zealand. And subsequent to that, ran Australian Infrastructure Fund, which was a $1 billion plus listed infrastructure fund. Joining me on the management team, I'm delighted to have Tessa Nye, our Chief Operating Officer. Tessa, again, very, very strong credentials and extensive experience in both the investment banking and funds management space, with a particular focus on infrastructure. And also Tom Crantock, our portfolio analyst. And Tom's background is in chartered accounting, and he brings to the table just incredibly specialised financial modelling and portfolio analysis skills that really drive our quantitative decision making. So we think it's a very balanced team. We also have access through the fund of funds model to the very experienced teams at both Atlas Infrastructure and Infrastructure Capital Group. But we do see the team having a level of experience that's unusual in the sector, and we think that's a real competitive advantage.
Absolutely. A final question, Peter, and it's in relation to, I guess, a medium-term outlook on the market you operate in and your objectives over the next 6 to 12 months. Would you mind expounding upon that?
Sure, absolutely. So at the very heart of it, our objectives remain as they've been since day one, which is, as I mentioned before, to provide our investors with long-term low volatility returns as a result of investment in a portfolio of high-quality infrastructure assets. Our target return remains 8%, with at least 4% of that in the form of gross yield. We think we're very well positioned in both the short term and the longer term to continue to meet those objectives. And in fact, we're reasonably excited about the prospect for the fund for the next 12 months. I think if we look ahead, think about what's going to really drive portfolio performance and investor decision making for the next 12 months, we think there's really going to be three key factors. The first is the likelihood of ongoing volatility in global markets and GDP, the re-emergence of inflation and the continued emergence of inflation as a key investment theme. And finally, this continued push for investors to look to increase their exposure to renewable energy assets. So we think the combination in our portfolio of a largely unlisted focus and a focus on core and super core assets, and therefore very low exposure to GDP in global markets, combined with a very high degree of correlation with and therefore protection against inflation, and a very high proportion of the portfolio invested in renewable energy assets, really ticks all the boxes. And we think, as I say, we're ideally placed in the short term and the longer term to continue to deliver returns and value to our investor base.
Absolutely. Well, Peter, it sounds like everything, all the stars are aligned, and you've got the track record, the team, and the forward-looking outlook that's quite exciting for prospective investors, and we wish you the best now and in the future. And for anyone who would like to speak to the team at CRIISP Infrastructure, we will have the details to the deal room at the side of the screen. And Peter, thanks again for joining me today.
Perfect. My pleasure, Sidney.
Thank you.